Ia Drang Valley, Central Highlands of Vietnam, November 1965. The war was escalating as the U.S. Army encountered the main force of the North Vietnamese Army for the first time in a large-scale battle. At this point, General William Westmoreland had just received a massive influx of American troops into South Vietnam, carrying with them the confidence that superior firepower and mobility would soon find and destroy the enemy. Meanwhile, after years of directing guerrilla warfare in the South, the General Staff of the People's Army of Vietnam decided to enter a new phase, secretly deploying regular regiments down the Ho Chi Minh Trail into the South, ready for direct confrontation with U.S. forces. Ia Drang Valley, an unforgiving jungle basin near the Cambodian border, soon became the fateful meeting ground for both sides. From November 14 to 18, 1965, this place witnessed a historic clash, the first major engagement between the United States Army and the People's Army of Vietnam throughout the entire Vietnam War. Before the real battle began, in late October 1965, North Vietnamese forces under the overall command of Front B3, the Central Highlands Command, with main units including the 32nd and 33rd Regiments of the 320th Division and the 66th Regiment of the 304th Division, had surrounded the Plime Special Forces camp in Pleiku Province. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVM, was ordered to send relief forces, but they soon fell into a well-laid ambush. However, thanks to heavy artillery and helicopter gunship support from the U.S., the Allied troops narrowly avoided a devastating defeat and withdrew to strengthen their defenses. After that failure, the 32nd and 33rd Regiments of the North Vietnamese Army were forced to retreat deep into the foothills of the Chu Pong Massif within the Ia Drang Valley to evade B-52 bombing and reorganize their forces. At that very moment, the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, a newly deployed elite unit renowned for its helicopter-borne mobility, received orders to pursue the retreating enemy. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, 43 years old, commander of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, part of the 1st Cavalry Division, was tasked with landing his troops into the valley to grab the tiger by the tail to cut off and destroy the enemy. After conducting aerial reconnaissance, Moore selected a small clearing about the size of a football field at the base of the Chu Pong Mountains as the landing zone, codenamed X-Ray. What Lieutenant Colonel Moore did not know was that surrounding this area were 3 North Vietnamese regiments, some 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers, quietly positioned and ready for battle. And thus, in the thick mountain fog, began the clash of 2 strategies, 2 military doctrines, and 2 fighting spirits. On the morning of the 14th of November 1965, the sky over the Ia Drang Valley thundered with the distinctive roar of dozens of UH-1 Huey helicopters descending in formation toward landing zone X-Ray, a small clearing in the dense jungle at the foot of the Chu Pong Massif. This was the first wave of troop insertions in the search and destroy campaign that the U.S. Army hoped would shift the balance of power in the Central Highlands. Before takeoff, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, commander of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, Airmobile, stood before his men and delivered his now famous vow in a steady voice. "I can't promise you that I'll bring all of you home alive, but I swear before God that when we go into battle, I'll be the first to set foot on the field and the last to leave it. Whether alive or dead, we will all come home together." That pledge, solemn and electrifying, spread through the battalion like a sacred command. At exactly 10:48 a.m., the first wave of helicopters dropped off Captain John Herron's Bravo Company, accompanied by Lieutenant Cole Moore himself, onto the clearing at X-Ray. By 11:20 a.m., Captain Tony Nadal's Alpha Company had also arrived to reinforce the position. At first, the area seemed eerily quiet, but around noon, as advance patrols began probing into the sparse jungle surrounding the landing zone, they suddenly made contact with the enemy. The first firefight erupted, and Bravo Company clashed head-on with the North Vietnamese 9th Battalion, turning the jungle around X-Ray into a chaotic battlefield, echoing with bursts of AK-47 and M16 fire. Amid the confusion, a platoon led by 2nd Lieutenant Henry Herrick pursued a small enemy group too far, inadvertently straying beyond command range. They ran straight into an ambush. Herrick was killed instantly in the first volley, and his 29-man platoon was quickly surrounded on a small knoll just over 100 meters from the main American line. Sergeant Ernie Savage, the platoon's ranking survivor, immediately took command. He organized his men into a crescent-shaped defensive perimeter and called in artillery strikes to keep the enemy at bay. For hours, Herrick's platoon, later immortalized by the Americans as the Lost Platoon, fought desperately, encircled by waves of North Vietnamese assaults and relentless gunfire. All of Lieutenant Colonel Moore's attempts to break through and rescue them that day failed under the intensity of enemy fire. Not until the afternoon of November 15 did U.S. forces finally reach and relieve the platoon. Of the original 29 men, only 13 were still able to fight. The extraordinary endurance and courage of those soldiers not only became a symbol of bravery, but also played a crucial tactical role. By holding their ground, they pinned down and exhausted a large enemy contingent, sparing the entire battalion from being flanked and annihilated in the opening hours of the Battle of Ia Drang. Throughout the afternoon and night of November 14th, the American troops huddled defensively around Landing Zone X-Ray, hastily building a semicircular perimeter with sandbags, tree roots, and whatever materials they could find, bracing for reinforcements. As darkness fell, the thick jungle mist of the Central Highlands became an ally of the North Vietnamese forces. Taking advantage of the terrain, they crawled close to the American lines and launched repeated human wave assaults against the perimeter. Mortar rounds, sniper fire, and shouted battle cries echoed through the valley. In the flickering darkness, the U.S. soldiers fought for every yard of ground, every tree trunk, suffering heavy casualties during that brutal first night. Yet, with precise long-range artillery support and the defensive ring of M60 machine guns, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's battalion held its ground, maintaining control of the X-ray perimeter. At dawn on November 15th, having received additional reinforcements, the North Vietnamese Army launched its largest assault of the battle, aiming to annihilate the American forces at X-ray. Hundreds of soldiers stormed the perimeter from 3 directions, firing as they charged headlong into the trenches. Some assault groups broke through, forcing savage close-quarters combat. The attackers deliberately targeted key personnel officers and radio operators in an attempt to cripple U.S. command and communication systems. This tactic of hugging the enemy, fighting at point-blank range, neutralized American artillery and air support, inflicting serious losses. Amid the chaos, Lieutenant Colonel Moore remained composed. Over the radio, he issued the emergency code Broken Arrow, a call signaling that an American unit was on the brink of being overrun and required immediate, all-out air support. Within minutes, the skies over Ia Drang thundered with F-100 Super Sabres, A-1 Sky Raiders, and even distant B-52 Stratofortresses, unleashing devastating strikes. Waves of napalm and artillery fire turned the jungle into an inferno, obliterating multiple enemy assaults. But in the confusion, one napalm bomb tragically fell perilously close to friendly lines, causing severe American casualties. Several soldiers were badly burned, some killed. An embedded war correspondent, Joe Galloway, covering the battle firsthand, was slightly wounded in the blast. Despite their suffering, the Americans fought on with remarkable resolve. Moments of extraordinary heroism emerged amid the carnage. Lieutenant Walter Marm of Alpha Company, seeing his men pinned down by an enemy machine gun nest in a bamboo thicket, single-handedly charged forward, hurled grenades to destroy the position, and swept the remaining enemy with his AR-15. He was struck in the face, shattering his jaw, yet continued to command until the fight subsided. For his valor, Marm later received the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military decoration. On another flank, machine gunner specialist Willie Parrish held his ground on the left side, firing relentlessly to repel successive attacks until his last belt of ammunition ran out. When the battle ended, more than 100 enemy bodies were found around his position. Thanks to such acts of bravery, by midday on November 15th, the large-scale assaults of the North Vietnamese Army had been broken. The Americans retained control of Landing Zone X-Ray and swiftly reorganized their defenses. That same afternoon, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry Regiment, 2/5, was airlifted in to reinforce the perimeter, solidifying the defensive line and setting the stage for the next phase of the Battle of Ia Drang. On the 16th of November, 1965, sporadic fighting continued around the base of the Chupong Massif. though its intensity had greatly diminished. After 2 days of unsuccessful assaults, North Vietnamese forces gradually withdrew the remnants of their units across the Cambodian border to preserve strength. The battle at Landing Zone X-Ray officially came to an end, closing 3 brutal days and nights of combat. The Americans had achieved their tactical goal, holding their position and maintaining unit integrity, while the North Vietnamese managed to avoid complete destruction. During those 3 days, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, suffered heavy losses, 79 killed and more than 120 wounded. Even so, the U.S. military claimed to have inflicted several hundred enemy casualties, captured important documents, and demonstrated the effectiveness and flexibility of air mobility tactics in jungle warfare. However, that temporary success was soon overshadowed by a devastating tragedy, the ambush at LZ Albany, which American journalists would later call the Silent Massacre. On the morning of November 17, after orders were given to clear Landing Zone X-Ray, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, 2 7ths under Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade, received instructions to march overland through the jungle toward Landing Zone Albany, where helicopters would extract them back to base. Roughly 500 soldiers set off through sparse woodland, their formation stretching nearly 600 meters, with minimal reconnaissance and little caution. At 1:15 p.m., as the column was moving through a lightly forested area of the valley, it walked straight into a carefully prepared ambush by the 8th Battalion, 66th Regiment of the North Vietnamese Army. The enemy waited until the American center was fully within the kill zone, then opened fire simultaneously from close range. Heavy machine guns, AK-47 seconds, and mortars erupted, shattering the U.S. formation into isolated fragments. The first volleys killed more than 30 men within minutes, including most of the battalion's command staff. Many soldiers were cut down before they could react. Others panicked and scattered under the withering fire, some tragically shooting their own comrades in the confusion. Within 10 minutes, the entire battalion was nearly paralyzed. Amid the chaos, small pockets of surviving American troops tried to form defensive clusters in the jungle, using radios to call for artillery and air support. It took several agonizing hours and the concentrated intervention of helicopter gunships and fighter bombers before U.S. forces managed to regain control of the area and drive back the North Vietnamese ambushers. When the smoke finally cleared, the scene was nightmarish. Wounded men lay scattered across the valley, interspersed with the bodies of dozens of fallen comrades strewn among shattered trees and scorched grass. The Battle of Albany became one of the bloodiest losses suffered by the U.S. Army during the entire Vietnam War. In just a few hours, 155 American soldiers were killed on the spot, and more than 120 were wounded, numbers that stunned the Pentagon. Although the contemporary press largely withheld detailed coverage to avoid causing public alarm, for the surviving troopers of the 1st Cavalry Division, the Albany Valley remained a haunting memory, a grief as deep as that of X-Ray, where the war had already shown its full brutality and futility. Over the 4 days and nights in mid-November 1965, the Americans lost roughly 234 men killed in action and more than 250 wounded. Losses were not evenly distributed. Nearly 2/3 of the fatalities occurred in the ambush at Albany on November 17, about 155 men, while the remainder fell mainly to Hal Moore's 1/7 at X-Ray, about 79 men. In other words, X-Ray was a bloody stand, but Albany was the crippling blow to a battalion moving in the open. A crude average would show the Americans suffering over 120 casualties, killed and wounded per day. But the reality was that intense, localized explosion points of fire consumed most losses within a few short hours. On the North Vietnamese side, casualty figures for Ia Drang remain disputed among sources. U.S. reports estimated enemy dead from 600 up to more than 1,000, whereas Hanoi's official count for the entire Battle of Ia Drang operation was about 554 killed and 700 wounded. How one frames the denominator dramatically changes the kill ratio. This divergence reflects the true fog of war: rugged terrain, heavy bombardment, and the practical difficulty of recovering and counting bodies after engagements. In the end, both sides paid a heavy price, and the raw numbers serve mainly as symbols of the ferocity the Ia Drang Valley witnessed. Whichever figures are accepted, Even at the lowest estimates, the battle functioned as a meat grinder. In less than a week, both sides left behind hundreds of dead. These post-battle tallies are not cold statistics alone. They foreshadowed the trajectory of the wider war to come. The United States would win many tactical engagements, but at an ever-rising cost for every gain, while the opponent was willing to pay with blood to turn the conflict into a test of will. After Ia Drang, both Washington and Hanoi proclaimed victory. For the Americans, they held landing zone X-ray, inflicted large enemy casualties, captured valuable documents, and proved the combat mobility of the airmobile doctrine, a new concept at the time. For the North Vietnamese, their ability to withstand massive U.S. firepower and withdraw in good order was presented as proof that they could confront the world's strongest military power on equal terms. But behind those propaganda declarations, both sides understood that Ia Drang was a first, decisive test of the resolve, tactics, and strategy that would shape the long war ahead. From a military standpoint, the Americans believed that Ia Drang had proven the superiority of air mobility warfare. Throughout the battle, dozens of UH-1 Huey helicopters flew constantly in and out of the valley through sheets of gunfire, delivering ammunition, water, and evacuating the wounded from the embattled perimeter at X-ray. Though many aircraft were riddled with bullet holes, most made it back to base, a fact that convinced U.S. commanders they had discovered the key to victory: speed, precision, firepower, and the ability to project intense combat anywhere, anytime. From that point on, the Huey became the defining symbol of the Vietnam War, its unmistakable sound forever etched into the memories of those who served. In practice, the Huey was far more than just a transport vehicle. It was the heart and lifeline of the entire tactical doctrine that shaped the conflict. Manufactured by Bell Helicopter and officially designated UH-1 Iroquois, this versatile aircraft could carry up to 11 troops plus cruise at over 190 kilometers per hour, and land on nearly any terrain. During the Ia Drang campaign, more than 400 Huey sorties were conducted for troop insertions, ammunition resupply, medical evacuation, and gunship support, an unprecedented scale in military history at the time. Thanks to the Huey, the 1st Cavalry Division, airmobile, could insert an entire battalion into a mountainous jungle valley without relying on ground roads, creating what commanders call a three-dimensional battlefield, where units could maneuver almost instantly. This agility convinced the American High Command they had found the ultimate tool of modern warfare: speed, firepower, and total battlefield coverage. General William Westmoreland himself praised the concept, declaring, "The Huey has ushered in a new era of mobile warfare." But for the soldiers on the ground, the Huey meant something much more personal. It was the sound of hope. The familiar whop-whop of rotor blades in the distance meant ammo, water, medics, and sometimes a ticket home. In later years, the sight of Hueys flying in formation across the smoky skies of Vietnam would become an enduring image, not only of the war itself, but of an entire generation of American soldiers. It stood as both a heroic and tragic emblem of faith, courage, and sacrifice. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the battlefield, the North Vietnamese drew their own invaluable lessons. In the aftermath of Ia Drang's firestorms, their commanders realized that massing troops in open terrain meant certain annihilation under U.S. artillery, bombs, and napalm. Colonel Nguyen Hua An, the North Vietnamese field commander at Ia Drang, adapted swiftly, pioneering the tactic known as grabbing the enemy by the belt, Nam Thot Lung Dich Ma Dan. His orders were simple, but deadly: close the distance, stay as near to the Americans as possible, and fight them up close, so that U.S. air and artillery support could no longer be used effectively. This hugging tactic stripped away America's greatest advantage, its superior firepower, forcing battles into brutal hand-to-hand combat, where courage, stamina, and sheer will determined survival. Later, General Von Nguyen Giap would elevate this approach into a broader strategic philosophy. The Americans possess technical and tactical superiority, but we have the strategy of a people's war, one that places human determination at its core. That is the Semding. Ia Drang thus became not only a clash of armies, but of doctrines, one side seeking to dominate through mobility and technology, the other through endurance and proximity. a grim preview of how the long Vietnam War would be fought in the years to come. The Battle of Ia Drang became the first and clearest illustration of that fundamental divide. The Americans emerged tactically victorious. They held the field, inflicted heavy losses on the enemy, and preserved most of their own force. Yet, a confidential report by U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to President Lyndon B. Johnson revealed a sobering truth. Despite America's overwhelming firepower and technological superiority, the prospect of achieving a decisive military victory in Vietnam was very uncertain. When Johnson read the report, alongside the casualty figures, he reportedly turned to his generals and asked in disbelief, "Does this mean that no matter what we do, we still can't win in Vietnam?" It was a question that, for the rest of the 1,960 seconds, no one in Washington could answer. Although post-battle assessments quickly exposed the sheer ferocity of Ia Drang, the U.S. High Command continued to regard it as an important victory, at least on paper. General William Westmoreland, commander of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, hailed the battle as proof of modern warfare's dominance, overwhelming firepower, aerial mobility, and battlefield discipline. According to U.S. estimates, enemy casualties outnumbered American losses by a ratio of 5 to 10 to 1, a golden ratio that Westmoreland believed, if sustained, could eventually erode the North Vietnamese Army's fighting capacity to the breaking point. From that conclusion, he built and entrenched the doctrine of the war of attrition. The goal was no longer to seize and hold territory, but to destroy the enemy's manpower through relentless combat. To pursue this strategy, Westmoreland urged a dramatic escalation of U.S. troop levels and the launch of large-scale search and destroy operations across South Vietnam. President Johnson soon approved the plan, authorizing a massive troop surge that would bring the American presence to over 500,000 soldiers by 1967, ushering in the most intense phase of the entire conflict. But reality quickly proved the doctrine hollow. The strategy yielded body counts, not victory. Each American win came at staggering cost, while the North Vietnamese only needed to endure bleeding steadily, but surviving long enough to wear down U.S. willpower. As one of Westmoreland's own staff officers would later admit bitterly, a strategy of attrition is proof that you have no strategy at all. On the opposing side, Hanoi understood all too well the limits of American strategy. Out of fear of international backlash and the risk of widening the conflict, Washington forbade U.S. troops from crossing into Cambodia or Laos in pursuit of retreating forces. This restriction inadvertently created a safe buffer zone for the People's Army of Vietnam. After each engagement, they could withdraw across the border to reorganize, rest, and return to battle with their strength nearly intact. By choosing the time, place, and conditions of combat, the North Vietnamese gradually pushed their opponent into a reactive posture, forcing the Americans to fight a war they could neither control politically nor sustain psychologically. As General Von Nguyen Giap had foreseen, the enemy must prolong the war in order to win, yet at the same time lacks the political and psychological capacity to pursue a prolonged war. That prophecy proved true, step by step. Westmoreland's war of attrition, intended to grind down the enemy, instead trapped America itself in a downward spiral, eroding public trust, dividing society, and compelling successive administrations to gradually scale back their ambitions. 10 years after Ia Drang, many observers would look back and realize this remote, rugged valley was not the beginning of victory, but an early warning, a sign that this was a war the United States could not win with firepower or technology alone. The price paid by both sides was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians perished during that decade of quagmire. Yet one thing remains unchangeable: the historical significance of the Battle of Ia Drang. It stands as the origin point of some of the most painful lessons ever learned about the limits of military power in a conflict where the enemy was willing to pay any price to endure. The battle also left a deep mark on American public consciousness. For the first time, the U.S. public confronted the reality that hundreds of young Americans could die in a single sudden encounter in a remote place few could even find on a map. The photographs, news reports, and soldiers' stories from Ia Drang began to shift American perception of the Vietnam War. It was no longer seen as a quick conflict, but as a bloody and endless quagmire. War correspondent Joseph L. Galloway, who had witnessed the horror firsthand, later co-authored the memoir We Were Soldiers Once and Young with Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore. Reflecting on those days, Galloway wrote that Ia Drang was the battle that changed the war because it forced both Washington and Hanoi to awaken to the true nature of their enemy. The impact of Ia Drang extended far beyond the battlefield or the corridors of power. In its aftermath, the U.S. Department of Defense was forced to change the way it delivered news of soldiers' deaths. Instead of sending cold, impersonal telegrams through the mail, the military began dispatching officers and chaplains to personally inform the families of the fallen. This humane reform, a seemingly small but deeply meaningful change, came about thanks to the compassion and persistence of Julia Moore, wife of Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, who had witnessed firsthand the heartbreak of 1/7th Cavalry families receiving multiple death notices in the days following the battle. It was one of the rare acts of humanity born from a war defined by loss. Years later, Hal Moore and journalist Joseph L. Galloway immortalized those experiences in their acclaimed memoir, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, published in 1992, which was later adapted into the 2002 film We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson. The film vividly recreated the desperate hours at Landing Zone X-Ray, portraying the courage, brotherhood, and raw humanity of soldiers trapped in the inferno of the jungle. It helped audiences around the world grasp the true cost, not only in lives, but in spirit of a long and senseless war. In the broader context of the Vietnam War, Ia Drang was not a decisive victory, but it was the beginning of the lessons that would define the entire conflict. The battle shaped the way both sides approached combat, strategy, and even their national psychology for years to come. More than half a century later, the Ia Drang Valley remains a symbol of courage, comradeship, and the haunting sorrow that forever lingers in the memories of veterans and their families. As one American officer once reflected, "In war, there are no happy endings. The best we can do is to learn from the losses so that the sacrifices of our comrades are not in vain." Years later, when Joseph Galloway returned to the old battlefield, a Vietnamese veteran told him quietly, "You fought bravely. So did we." No one won at Ia Drang, only the survivors carried the burden of memory. Ia Drang, with all its blood, smoke, and tears, remains that enduring lesson for both Americans and Vietnamese alike about the worth of devotion and the terrible price of war.